Hi, this is Paul. I want to do a video on life and story, and so I want to begin because Bret's been tweeting so much. I want to begin with a little clip from him and Alister McGrath on this observation
The
Bret makes
meat
right off the
of
bat.
what we're talking about tonight. I wonder if you could maybe give us a brief and hopefully layperson-friendly account of how you imagine religious belief arose in a strictly evolutionary sort of paradigm, Brett.
Sure. So the first thing I would say is what we don't tend to understand when we take a strict classic Darwinian perspective about humans is that human beings are the far end of a continuum. Most creatures have essentially one mode of inheritance, and it is genetic. We have a second mode, and it is cultural. And we are not completely alone. All of the other mammals have a cultural mode, and almost all of the birds have it, but that's a tiny fraction of the biota. But for those creatures that do have this second mode, what you have is a locale where information can be stored in a non-genetic form, and it can be acted upon by the very same kinds of Darwinian forces that shape genes. So in one sense, Dawkins introduced this idea with the concept of memes. It became clear in my conversation with him in October, though, that he didn't take the concept of memes very seriously, that he thought that it was loosely analogous to the genetic Darwinian process, but it didn't have important consequences. What I would argue to you is that we humans have offloaded a large fraction of the adaptive landscape to what I would call the software layer. Right? Our genomes do not create a functional creature. We are utterly helpless at birth, and our very long childhoods are a time period in which one can discover and basically self-program the software necessary for life. Now, what we do during that time is we largely pick up the wisdom of our immediate ancestors, who we meet, and then we augment it with things that we discover that they didn't know, which is a very small fraction of what we come to understand. So, if you take that paradigm, what you'll realize is that we get handed a belief system, that individuals whose belief system is a better match for the world have advantages. People whose belief systems are a poorer match for the world have disadvantages. And over time, those belief systems, the narratives that we hand off, will be refined by this process. And so this is so certain once you accept that we have these cultural traits and that better ones will inherently be passed on more often than worse ones. It is so certain that effectively we are talking about a tautology. When we talk about, for example, the narratives that go along with the life of Jesus, how is it possible that those narratives were not shaped by the fact that some versions of the story were more compelling, some versions of the story led to alterations in behavior that led populations to outcompete their rivals? These things effectively have to be true.
Let's see how serious he really wants to take his judgments. Because I like a lot of what he has to say there. Human beings are at the far end of a continuum and two modes of inheritance, genetic and cultural. Information can be stored and retrieved and used in a non-genetic form. What he's basically laying out is a certain form of natural law, or perhaps natural theology, if I might use the term in that way. Now, I'm going to play a little bit of information with gadgets here. I have said many times, and I will continue to say something to the effect, if I can continue to refine the metaphor, if I can continue to shape the meme, that story is our machine code or our instruction set. I don't know how many more videos I'll play during this video, so I'll just keep that handy. My head gets cold. I got a haircut right before it turned cold in Sacramento, and so I got no hair on top of my head to keep me warm. So, pardon the cap. And the cold. So one of the things that you might notice, or you may or may not know, is that the PC that I'm using right now, or most of you are using, is built on what's called an x86 chipset. That means it has an x86 instruction code. That's the code that lets the software communicate with the hardware. And this goes all the way back to the IBM PC. They took off-the-shelf parts, and Intel and a little bit AMD, for the most part, have been making chipsets and CPUs and processors that allow the software to run with the hardware. And now if you're using a smartphone like an Apple iPhone or an Android phone or an iPad, those use different instruction sets. Those use different machine codes. They use what's called ARM, which is a newer version, a newer chip architecture, which is more efficient. You can have instant on, instant off. You have nice integration with modems, which is why we're using it in smartphones. But you'll notice that neither Windows nor Mac OS work with that chipset. And this has led Intel to really work hard to try to continue to improve their legacy code of x86 and get it on newer machines. It's also why, for example, Microsoft, with its last product announcement, has two different Surface Pros. That's their main hardware offering. You have the Surface Pro 7, which continues to use the x86 chipset and Intel chips, and then they announced the Surface Pro X, which uses an ARM processor. Now it uses a specially modified ARM processor that allows code. Basically, they use software translation, I'll say it that way, to let certain programs that are written for x86 work on ARM. That's called an emulation. Now the problem is when you use an emulation, it's never as efficient as using the machine code that is built for the hardware. Now again, my assertion that story is our machine code. It's our instruction set. Story is the way that the hardware and the software interface. Now, Jordan Peterson was very, very helpful to this for me. It goes all the way back to his lobsters. That lobsters, and you read his chapter on lobsters and in 12 Rules for Life, or you can read his maps of meaning, or you can watch his videos. And basically, the lobsters, how they work with each other, their culture, their status hierarchies are regulated by serotonin. And if you're the top lobster, you get to be on top. And if you lose the fight with the lobster and your bottom lobster, that changes your physiology. And that's what Jordan Peterson talked about. And Jordan Peterson uses that as an illustration for how we are. Now, I've said many times before that for Jordan Peterson, meaning is sort of like this internal gyroscope. That's why when asked at one point what his most important rule is, he said, do what is meaningful and not what is expedient. Because meaning within the loss of the view of the stars within the iron box of secularity, so we no longer know how to navigate, because in secular society we're suspicious that the gods are absent and the gods are archaic and the gods are ancient wisdom which must be put away. Now if you guide yourself by meaning, you have a pretty good guide. Now, what we're doing there is trying to, often, especially via social media, we're trying to regulate status. And we're looking for what we can do to gain status, sort of like the top lobster. And basically what Jordan says is this isn't a bad way to sort of navigate if you, like all of us, have limited information. That will create for you more opportunities. It will create for you more status, more money, better mating opportunities, so on and so forth. But now narrative is sort of the way that we manage this stuff. Narrative is our common native compression scheme. We are, as I've mentioned before, if you watch Benjamin Boyce and John Vervaeke's conversation, Vervaeke makes the observation, something that I had thought about a number of years ago, was that basically what we are is a story. We at age 3 or 4, we start this process of we've learned how to make a little autobiography, and that is who we are. Now our bodies age and our bodies change, but the autobiography stays the same. And this is sort of our narrative compression scheme, and it's via these stories, the stories we tell about ourselves, the stories that have been told to others, the stories by which communities form and by which communities derive their principalities and powers, their own the constructed the constructive narrative beings that we really are as we're in collective groups. This is all done by story, and we pay careful attention to story because this is, in fact, again, the machine code. This is the operating system. It goes all the way down into our brains and goes all the way out throughout culture. And so if I were to tweak what Bret had to say, okay, culture, yes, but story is the machine code of culture. That's how it fundamentally works. Now, narrative is also our universal translator. It's sort of the way that different societies figure out how to talk to one another. As I'll get to before, we have this physical layer, okay, of the physical world, and then the storyverse. And so you have these two worlds, in a sense, that are always together, and they're deeply tied and they're deeply bonded in us. We are in many ways the nexus between these two worlds. Now, Carl Jung was a very helpful figure in this, in figuring this out, and I love the story that he tells in his biography, where he talks about the fact that as a young doctor, he went into a mental institution, and the other doctors told him to not bother talking to the patients because they're crazy. And he's like, yeah, they're crazy. That's why we're here, and aren't we supposed to help them? And the other patient said, no, they simply ramble. And so he began listening to the ramblings of these crazy people, and he began to notice that they're always telling stories, and the stories might seem fantastical, the stories might seem disconnected from reality, but he began to notice that the stories they told matched up with religious stories and other stories, and he began to wonder, can we work on the storyverse? And by working on the storyverse, can we bring health? In other words, what that insight that he had, along with others, began to realize that the cultural, the second track that Bret Weinstein was talking about. The second track is a very powerful and important track. In fact, if you look at Yuval Harari's book Sapien, he makes the point quite strongly in that book that, in fact, because genetics works so slowly, the story track for us is really in many ways the dominant story. But remember, these two tracks have to stay together. Because if the storyverse gets too disconnected from the physical universe, well, there are problems, because these things, in fact, work together. Now, I want to talk about a bunch of mapped dualities, because these mapped dualities are very common features culturally, historically, religiously. They are body and soul. They are heaven and earth. They are matter and mind. And now I've got Vervaeke in the back of my mind talking about the end of axial age mythologies, and that has a lot to do with this here. And whereas in secularity, the upper end of the duality is very much stressed and in doubt, and in a sense that's what secularity tries to do, is remove it. But I might argue that it's more like the firmament we find in Genesis 1, where the sun, the moon, and the stars are within it rather than outside of it. And so we'll continue to do a lot of thinking about the plausibility and the viability of these axial age mythologies. But what you'll realize is that probably part of the reason they're so pervasive with us is that they're so essential to us and so helpful for us. Now here I've got a picture of one of my grandmothers, and she lived in Grand Rapids, Michigan when I was there, and she lived not far away from where I was a student. And one day I went and visited her, and she told me, she said, I was, in my late teens, early 20s, I don't remember exactly when this was. And she said, when I think about myself, I think about myself at about the same age you are now. But when I look in the mirror, I'm this wrinkly old lady. And at this point, she was wearing a wig. She had lost much of her hair, and you can see the skin on her arms. And she was a shriveled old woman, and she lived into her 90s. But what she said to me always stuck with me, because I thought, well, I was just young and, I had that young body, and it's hard to realize when you're a young person what that is like. But this recognizes that we are weird two-partied creatures. Because on one hand, I've got this body, and I am this body, but this body, now that I'm in my mid-50s, this body is not the same body I had when I was my late teens, early 20s. I've got more fat, my hair is gone, my beard is gray. There's just a whole bunch of stuff that has happened to me, but the me that I think of as me is really this story. And here's the funny thing. My body has aged and decayed and gets sick. I remember one time I had a little procedure done, and whenever you have a little procedure done, whether it's dental or I had a little mole removed and the doctor is deadening something, and I'm watching the doctor work on my body and I can't feel it. And it's like, what's going on with that? Now the Bible in Genesis 2 has the story of creation, the story of God making man, the man in the garden, as he makes man out of clay and he breathes into it. In other words, man is the stuff of earth and the breath of God. Well, think about what God is in terms of, broadly speaking, ancient mythology. The gods or the God, as in the Bible, well, the God is eternal. He doesn't decay. Like our story self doesn't decay. Our soul doesn't decay. But our soul is tied to this body, and we are, the book of Genesis says, after creation, we are a living nephesh. We are a nephesh. We are a in a sense, an embodied story maker. And we make story with our bodies and with our minds. We make story in the physical world, and we make story in the storyverse. And these two things are always working together. Now, we feel the tension of this. And if you pay attention to what people say in terms of their life, what is their life? Well, is this body my life? Well, yes. And I'm very much in debt. I'm very much conscious and committed to keeping this body going. But in many ways, my life as I live it is in the storyverse. That's where, especially if as we have now, we have enough food and enough water and a relative degree of security, that our life is very much launched into this cultural sphere, this storyverse. Part of us is decaying, part of us is eternal. Now status, again, is of great importance to us. So I've got one of my daughters living at home now, and one of the things she likes to do is watch these Korean dramas. So on Netflix, we've been watching this K-drama, Another Miss O, and it's about two women with the same name, and they went to the same school together, and there's this conflict. And of course, in a sense, they're competing. Of course, it's a K-drama. They're competing for the love of one young man. And what is this whole story about? It's obviously, there's the pretty Miss O and the plain Miss O. Of course, they're both totally gorgeous, but because it's Korean dramas. But, all of this stuff has to do with status. Status is enormously important to us because it opens up opportunities, and it opens up privileges, and it opens up all sorts of things that we want. We are in that way, as Jordan Peterson said, not much different from the lobster. But the storyverse and the matterverse are for us deeply intertwined with strength, with beauty, with competence, with opportunity. And so when somebody says, my life is over, well, what do they mean? They mean that, well, their life, their physical life is over? No, that's not what they mean. They mean the story that they are deeply tied to. That is their life. That is our life. The New Testament, for example, at one point says, your life is hidden with Christ in heaven. And Paul is talking to people running around on the ground. What's he saying? This is our life. Jesus says, where your heart is another word in the Bible for this. Where your treasure is, that thing which you value, there will your heart be also. That thing that you call your life. This is how we live. And if you are cognizant of this duality, and you think about this duality in the back of your mind as you're watching people interact with each other, just pay attention and you'll notice how much of our lives isn't this story verse, this culture verse. Now, I've gone back a few times and watched Matt Dillahunty and Jordan Peterson's conversation. That really is a fun one. And what you'll find if you keep this in the back of your mind and you watch that, I'm thinking about maybe doing a video of going back through it, because Dillahunty keeps wanting to go back to the physical. Well, this is my life, but Matt, you don't live that way. And that's why Jordan Peterson keeps saying, you don't act like this is just your life. You act like this is just the beginning, but it's all of this stuff up here. And as Bret Weinstein says, that's right. Dawkins hasn't taken his meme idea near seriously enough, because this is the realm in which, in many ways now, in terms of human history, all the real magic and tragedy happens. Because, as I say, well, what is more real? Well, right now for us, what is more real is the thing that colonizes the other. And right now, the storyverse is colonizing my mouth and colonizing my hands and colonizing my use of time and colonizing all of these things. And in fact, what you very quickly learn is that what human beings have been trying to do is master the material by way of the story. And if you look at human culture and civilization, it's one grand effort at that we're mastering. We're trying to, again, this is very old, commonly religious, we're trying to subdue the animal desires and put them subject to the storyverse. Because the degree to which we can subject the animal, the physical, to the story is the degree to which we can do amazing things that we think about in the storyverse. And so when they have this conversation about, Dillahunty keeps wanting to resort to instinct. But if you go back and you watch my last video where I talked about Bret Weinstein, instinct is a minor player for us compared to the storyverse. Instinct, we have lots of instincts. We have the desire to eat. We have the desire to preserve our own life. We have the desire to mate. We have the instinct to watch over our children. We're just full of instincts. And so that's why C.S. Lewis says, imagining instinct is telling you morality is like imagining people tell you to morality. There's just so many of them. So it's not just the body. People commit suicide over story. In fact, suicide is one of the main illustrations of the dominion of the storyverse over our physical nature in many, many ways. Now that's a common fight back and forth. The Apostle Paul talks about it. You'll find anybody who's devoted themselves to any kind of religious training, this is the fight. You'll see it in a variety of religious traditions. But the definition of life is not simply this physical thing. For us, life is, well, it's the culture. And when Bret Weinstein imagines that we sometimes somehow have to get a hold of this, it's all culture talking, okay? It's not the physical, or it's far less the physical. To be a human being is to function in the storyverse, and I just mentioned before Yuval Harari's Sapien quotes, and you can find them there. Now, the denial of the storyverse is a very dangerous idea, and Carl just expressed skepticism in the comment of my last video about some of the comments that I've been making while I'm reading Timothy Snyder's Black Earth. And again, I recommend this book highly in terms of understanding the relationship between the Nazis and materialism. The Nazis were philosophically very literal Darwinists, okay? And if you read much history, especially before World War II, about the kind of ideas that were commonly floating around about eugenics and about improving the species and all kinds of speculation about, well, certain races being less evolved than other races, the Nazis basically, and again, I always wondered what the deal was with Jewishness. For the Nazis, Jewishness was the storyverse which corrupted the evolution of the races. And of course, in many ways, they're following Nietzsche here. That, well, it's all of this slave morality and slave mentality. And so what the Nazis figured we needed to do is get rid of all this Jewishness so that so that our animal selves could continue the natural process of evolution. And that's why Timothy Snyder entitles his book, The Holocaust Has History and Warning. And whereas most of us think very simplistically, oh, we don't want to repeat this again, what we don't think through are all the subtle pathways by which we in fact do repeat this again. All right? The Nazis sought to eliminate all that storied distraction so that humanity and Earth could continue to evolve. And this is why Tom Holland made those comments about Nazi environmentalism and contemporary environmentalism. If you want to understand a warning, you understand it early on. People today, of course, are warning about climate change, or warning about the death of the oceans, or warning about overfishing. You see something early on and you say, these are the building blocks to that which we saw more fully developed. So be warned. That's how warnings work. They're very uncomfortable connections between this and contemporary issues. So again, I very much recommend Timothy Snyder's Black Earth. Now you got Richard Dawkins and Joe Rogan sitting on their podcast wondering, well, where did all the religions come from? Well, they don't understand what Bret Weinstein basically said, that this culture thing is most of what we deal with. It's most of what we think of. It's most of where all the action is going on in terms of human beings. And again, because Harari said genetics works very slowly, but the storyverse works very quickly and very powerfully. What they can't figure out is that because story is the machine code, that, well, all of these stories are us working through, again, listen to Peterson, read Jung. This is all us trying to get a handle on our world. And we do this by story because this is how we interact with the world and how we interact with each other. Because again, critical to all of this is understanding humanity's enormous capacity for cooperation. And listen to our friend Adam, who runs the Think Club channel. It's the storyverse. It's this cooperative ability that religion affords that allows groups to, in fact, compete well with each other and dominate each other. And it's story by which we come together and are able to act as the collaborative people we are, that allows human beings to group up beyond just, those who are connected by bloodline. Marriage, in fact, is the way that people are able to transcend and create family members out of not family members. That's a storyverse function. Tribes huddle around storied individuals. Religion, and a lot of religion is the way that people can actually come together. And so when Bret Weinstein later on in Unbelievable talks about, trying to do this, and, well, it's not going to be religion, what he doesn't understand is that story is dominating, and religion and all of the stuff that goes into religion are the ways that, in fact, we come together. It's behind nations. It's behind all of this stuff. This is all driven by story. And if you want to get millions and billions of people on the same page, it's going to be with story. It's not going to be with rational arguments. And this is why the rationalists always lose, and they're going to keep losing, because the rationalists will sit there and throw up their little debunking cards. But I'm going to tell you right now, everybody's flocking to the movies and watching Netflix because it is our machine code. Now, they will argue that agency detector is a survival strategy, okay? And so our agency detectors are a little hyperactive, the celebrity atheists tell us. And the reason is because if you assume as a scared little animal that your hunter can employ reason, you're going to employ the spirit of finesse. And you can look that back at my other videos. You're going to approach the future very carefully with your eyes wide open, ready for action. And again, I will argue the way we do this is story. There's a lion in the bushes. That's a story, and that motivates us to be ready. And then what do you tell the children in the village? There's a lion in the bush. There's a tiger in the jungle. This is how we communicate to one another and how the entire tribe can keep the children safe and keep everyone on the same page. This gets a little bit into Bret's metaphorical truth, but he complains about Dawkins, and I complain about Bret that he doesn't take this stuff anyway seriously enough. And okay, so let's assume the universe is designed, because if there's a greatest threat that takes all of our lives, it's the universe. And so what are we trying to do with these stories? We are grappling with death. Now, pay attention here, because our presuppositions are playing very determinatively beneath this, and I'm telling this story in a sense as a secularist, just so that you'll understand and I won't turn you off. Adam keeps complaining to me that I could do a better job talking to people if I didn't keep getting religious like I do. Now I'm making an argument here for religion from the bottom, similar to what Jordan Peterson had been doing. One of the things that you realize in the Bible, if you read the Bible compared to many other creation myths, is that the Bible is amazingly secular with its monotheism. The Bible has a radical simplification of the world to one divine intelligence at the top of the hierarchy. Instead of creation being all of these different gods, that a god like Marduk, opens up Tiamat, his dead mother, and you have heaven and earth, or Nut and Geb in the Egyptian mythology where they copulate and that then produces fertility. What you find in the Bible is this amazing story where you have this one divinity who speaks order into chaos and functional creation happens. Esther cringes every time I say it, but read John Walton's books on some of this stuff. Very, very interesting stuff. Genesis 1 is not a story of competing sub-deities responsible for the functioning of the world. In other words, God creates this functional world in which there is actually process, and things, in a sense, go on their own, but there's this high God up there, which is exactly, of course, what secularity wants to get rid of. That, of course, takes, hundreds and thousands of years. But now along comes Jordan Peterson, and Jordan Peterson makes the observation that sacrifice works. Well, why does sacrifice work? Now, he did a really wonderful, I spoke to Jordan in April of 2018, and you can find the video on my channel. And about this time, he was staying in the same place. He told me in our conversation that he was going to do this video of 5 parts on Easter. And he wrote a piece in the Times of London and did a bunch of things. A lot of these ideas are in 12 Rules for Life and in Maps of Meaning, but he makes the observation that sacrifice works. And similar to what you heard from Bret, if groups are sacrificing, this offers them an advantage. Now, you might say, well, scientifically, sacrificing a goat or a chicken, how does that help? Because maybe I can establish a control group, and I'll find groups who sacrifice and groups who don't, and the sacrifices don't seem to be efficacious. They don't seem to arrive at the kinds of outcomes that we seem to be able to predict with science. Maybe we do cloud seeding to up the production of clouds, or maybe we have meteorology to announce the coming of rain to Sacramento. But Peterson says that sacrifice is actually a pretty important thing, because in a sense, what we do is we discover the future. And part of why sacrifice works is that the future is so full of people. The future is, in fact, personal. And so we discover the future. And again, now where is the future in terms of the physical world? The physical world is always in the now. Okay? Now time is time-space. Time has a certain physicality, but it's very mysterious. But when it comes to us, we always live in the physical now. But the future is part of the storyverse. The future is many ways a story we tell ourselves. And what sacrifices do is we begin to engage with the future. And sacrifice works. Now, what do you mean it works? Does it work scientifically? Does it work efficaciously? perhaps it doesn't work in a linear scientific way. And if you read ancient mythologies, you'll notice that, for example, with the sack of Rome in 410, those who continued to be pagans, not the Christians, were complaining that Rome was sacked because they neglected the sacrifices. And in a point that I've made in a variety of my other videos, one of the interesting contrasts between the literature from the priests of the Egyptians and the Babylonians is that the priests are always harping on people to do the sacrifices, but you can kind of live the way you want. The Hebrews have this sacrificial covenant thing, which in fact eventually sacrifice goes away and covenant takes over, and that your God cares how you live. Now again, this is so thoroughly absorbed and assumed by our societies, it doesn't even sound like news, but if you read the Bible, you can actually watch this migration underway because the layers are all there. The Hebrew prophets lead the way through this evolution of the culture verse. Again, it was Bret who wants to talk about this as an evolutionary process, even a Darwinian evolutionary process, Bret is stipulating. People who learn to sacrifice, Jordan Peterson says, do statistically better mostly. What does that mean? That means they learn self-control. They learn to engage with the future. They learn to live in the future. In other words, you can begin to see the power of this story verse because truth be told, if I feed my dog eats as much as he can right away because the future is uncertain. Squirrels try to hide nuts, but they forget where a lot of those nuts are. What do we as sacrificial human beings do? We sacrifice the present for the future. But pay attention, this is all done in the story verse, and this is all done with characters, because not only do I have to think about me now, I have to think about me in the future. And not only do I have to think about me and my family, I think about us as something, and we as a group are a principality, and we as a group come together and form a unit, and we make decisions together. And you very quickly, it's not too hard to imagine how all of this machinery gets employed, and in Bret Weinstein fashions, groups that can employ this story cultural machinery can actually make progress into the future because they have gods. All right? Because they have gods, because they can do this. And again, I'm just talking from the bottom here. That's my goal in this video, to talk from the bottom until the very end, and where I go back into pastor mode, but you can skip that and not believe it if you want to. People is a communal principality and agent, and so suddenly we have, and in fact we do this all the time, we talk about whole principalities operating, like Christianity or ideas, and they're all operating. We in fact, within the story verse, these things have agency, and we talk that way. And the reason we talk that way is because it in fact works. Now, one of the things you begin to notice when you read the Bible is that even within the Bible, there are struggles within ideas about God. And one of the oldest books in the Bible, and one of the places where you can watch these struggles unfold, is in fact the book of Job. And Job is a man who has been blessed by God, and the accuser, Satan, comes to God and says, Job is only good because it pays. Now we're getting into Bret Weinstein's Darwinian culture verse. Job is only good because it pays. Job is such a master at sacrifice. He's such a master at story verse that his life is succeeding. Okay, God, take away his abundance and we'll see how moral he is. And so, of course, God does so. And all of his children are wiped out, and all of his flocks are stolen and wiped out, and Job is reduced to ruin, and there's Job's wife sitting next to him. He's in sackcloth and ashes, and her refrain to Job is, curse God and die. Now, whenever you use God, do not lose sight of God, number one. And those of you watching my videos for a while will know what I'm talking about. Do not lose sight of the part of the conception of God that is the sum total of everything in the world. That is, in a sense, the divine passive, which you can find in Scripture and many other languages. That God is something, the imagined manifestation of everything that there is. That is, and you see this in pantheistic type ideas. And C.S. Lewis says pantheism is sort of our natural religion, and it's only actually overcome in very few times and places and by only certain groups. But this pantheism is in a sense the first, most basic, built into us story verse definition of God. But there's a tension in that, because if you really understand pantheism and you talk about that, what you realize is that it falls apart, because such a God can't really act. There's no personhood. There's no agency. There's no God that you can really relate to and bargain with. Turn to Genesis 18, where Abraham bargains with God over the fate of Sodom and whether God will sweep away the righteous with the unrighteous. And so, again, the Bible is full of these stories, and all of these things are getting negotiated. And for us as individuals, this is why people continue to go to church and people continue to read the Bible, is that all of this stuff is very much part of who we are today. Now, the first conception of karma you see in a sense of God, you see in a sense of Job's friends, and it goes very much like this: success or good fortune equals favor with God. That's a very pantheistic way of conceptualizing this, because if your life is going well, then God or the gods are favoring you. And if your life is going poorly, then you have done things to anger the gods and they are against you. Now, you can very quickly see that polytheism is a way to modulate these. And if you look in Greek mythology, well, you've got some gods in your favor and some gods are against you. And therefore, in the story verse, you have the story of all of this wrangling between the gods. Read Homer. It's all right there in Homer. See, part of the problem we have is people are no longer reading Homer, and they're no longer reading mythology, and they think all these stories are made up. What you don't see is that all of these stories are the machinery by which individuals and communities are trying to come to grips with the world. Religion is natural. Story is natural. We're at the far end of this continuum. This is all culture. We're all working this stuff through. And again, probably nothing so far is anything that Bret Weinstein would disagree with. But so the common take that the book of Job is wrestling with is karma and morality. It's My Name is Earl, the old sitcom on American TV. Do good and you'll be rewarded. Do bad and do bad things and you'll be punished by the gods. That's basic religion, as Tim Keller calls it. But the world is more complex than that. Morality is doing what doesn't work. This is sacrifice, like not lying, like telling the truth. Morality is doing what doesn't work and getting hurt because of it. And so what you find is Job is, in a sense, the friends are scapegoating Job in their quest to preserve their karmic basic religion, and Job is announcing his innocence. Now, in the story in Job, we know from the beginning, and we'll see in the end, how God deals with this. But Job is caught in the middle. And this is part of the reason the book of Job continues to be a very popular book. But the question is, how does this square with the world? And what you see is that religion is the working out of these basic foundational issues. Now, when life is good and food is secure and we have lots of power and we live in these amazing democracies that keep us safe and we have electricity to keep us warm, people can ponder in a lovely warm studio in LA, oh yeah, I don't know where these religions come from. Get out into other places of the world and look at suffering people and watch them deal with their religion. Part of the reason perhaps that religion is so popular is because non-religious people, if life is bad, it's rational to just end it, isn't it? And people like that don't reproduce as much as religious people. Religious people, you can check this today, almost always reproduce more than non-religious people. And that continues today. So, story, here's the thing that story does for you. Story scales beyond the moment. In the moment, I might feel hungry, or I might feel thirsty, or I might feel scared, or I might feel depressed, or I might feel horny, or I might feel on top of my game, whatever. Story scales beyond the moment. Sacrifice gets us beyond the moment. And in fact, what this learns for what Job has to do then is endure the suffering and actually await in the hopes of his vindication. His wife tells him, curse God and die. That's suicide by God. Job won't do it. Job wants his day in court. Now, his day in court doesn't necessarily go the way Job imagines it will, but in the end, it works out very, very well for Job, which is, of course, the point of the story. Now, Israel breaks the communal Job script. Now, there's a lot of debate in biblical scholarships about the book of Job. Many believe Job is not a Hebrew character. Many believe that in wisdom literature, the Hebrew scribes adapted the book of Job and incorporated within it a lot of the theology that was growing in Israel. And a lot of this happens in the exile because according to the script, when the Babylonians come down and destroy the temple at Jerusalem, Marduk won. And what that meant was that Marduk was top god and Yahweh would now have to be his vassal. That's a polytheistic way of working through these issues. But the Hebrew prophets changed the script. God comes and visits Ezekiel in his refugee camp outside of Babylon. What's with that? And the book of Daniel, you see this in the book of Daniel. There's two things going on. First of all, the first part of the book of Daniel, chapters 1 through 6, are all these ordeals, which are contests. And the Lord, via his proxy, Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, keep coming out on top. That's the first part of the book of Daniel. The second part of the book of Daniel is sort of inside Daniel's world. Whereas on one hand, in all likelihood, Daniel had been castrated so that he wouldn't have inconvenient sons like the Trumps and the Bidens. Daniel is castrated, and Daniel is a slave of the empire, and that's what his whole life is. But you have the question, what can God do when empire comes in and devours the world? That's the object of Daniel 7. And in Daniel 7, a son of man comes with the clouds of heaven after the Ancient of Days puts down these imperial sea monsters and is given an eternal kingdom. And Daniel watches this vision. And what we find in the book of Daniel is the inklings of the resurrection. And this theology will develop through the intertestamental period, and we'll find it full-blown by the New Testament period. In Daniel, we first posit a resurrection. The wicked will not finally win. You shall die, and you can still win. The meek will inherit the earth. And by meek, I don't mean, those people who threaten to use violence or have violence available to them. These are the victims of violence. That's why Jesus' beatitude is so thoroughly countercultural. Because what happens in the story verse is that now there is resurrection, and now Daniel can be, and this is what you see in chapters 1 through 6 of the book of Daniel, Daniel can both be the best servant of the emperors and also the best underminer of their kingdoms. And those are the issues that you see happening in the book of Daniel, and why the book of Daniel was so popular in the period of Jesus' ministry in first century Judea, because they're wrestling with all of these issues. Why should I sacrifice myself now and my appetites in order to achieve something in the future, maybe even something that I may or may not participate in? What the resurrection offers is participation in that future. So then when rationality rules is wringing his hands because you have all these young people that are saying, I'll be dead someday. So what if there's global warming? Shrug. What do I care? There's the big sleep. There's nothing burger before, and there's the big sleep after, which is nothing too. So why don't I eat, drink, and be merry now? Oh, and you wonder about the consequences for the loss of religion? You wonder why young people here, you've been telling them there's just between 0 and 80, having your best life now. This is at the top of the hierarchy. Oh, no, but you should sacrifice your welfare and your play and all of your amusements so that coming generations can enjoy the earth without your contamination. And you expect them to be able to do this? You're living off, as Jordan Peterson said, the decaying carcass of previous generations. And now Bret Weinstein now suddenly wants to mobile everyone, but we can't use religion. And again, you think Dawkins isn't paying attention to meme? You're not paying attention to what you said. Because religion is how human beings do this work. And there are consequences for that. Read Miroslav Volf's Exclusion and Embrace, 2002, Louisville. It's a great book. But the book talks about what Miroslav Volf talks about a lot. He grew up in he was an adult during the civil war in Yugoslavia, which had been thoroughly secularized by communists. And guess what he discovered? No afterlife story verse is extremely consequential for our dirty little deeds today, because all scores must be settled here. Adolf Hitler got away with it. Joseph Stalin got away with it. Chairman Mao got away with it. And if they can get away with it in big things, how many little things can't we all get away with? And why not try? Because in the end, what's the worst they can do to you? Kill you. No God of judgment? Justice must come now. Now, René Girard, in the work that he did, noted, well, what you're talking about is the kingdom of Satan and the kingdom of God. And I've read this quote in past. Well, maybe I'll read it again. It's not very long. Jesus is the only man to live on this earth in such a way that he can destroy single-handedly the kingdom of Satan. What's the kingdom of Satan? It's the suspicion that he casts on Job. It's the accusations for one of us. It's our fight in the now, to grab what we can between 0 and 80 and have our best life now and screw everyone else and screw any future too. He says that the victim he offers us is a scapegoat, and that the scapegoat is guilty, and we take him as guilty. And then we divinize that victim, and then we have order. So in other words, if we can only get rid of Trump, then the world will be better. Oh, if we can only get rid of Obama, then the world will be better. If we can only get rid of the Dems or the reps, and on and on and on. But Jesus crushes that order forever by refusing Satan's offer. Why don't we refuse Satan's offer? Because we're living in the now, and we're not sufficiently steeped in all of this stuff that religion has been affording us ever since. He is expelled, and he is a scapegoat. But he takes it upon himself. He is a willing scapegoat. See, and this is crazy stuff. Why would Jesus give his life? Why would Jesus give his life? It's the only life he has. You only live once, right? He prefers to die, in other words, than to share in sacrificing of others. Well, what this says is that for Jesus, his physical body and his story verse were very much in relationship, because he said, I will allow myself to be killed for the sake of the future. No greater has any love than to lay down his life for his friend, or even his enemy. He prefers to die rather than to join the mob with Peter. The kingdom of Satan is autonomous. It runs by itself, in the sense that it is a circle of violence that is shut upon itself. That's Darwin, right? Jesus opens it. He violates the rules with impunity. Finally, they kill him, and it doesn't do any good. Well, that's if you actually believe the resurrection. but we'll get back to that. You see, the thing is, our world is built on this story. This story is an achievement. You can afford the value, you can afford to value the weak, as Bret Weinstein does, because via the storyverse, the old simple religious script of karma has been broken. The storyverse actually transcends time and affords new options over the karmic calculations of the now. What Jordan Peterson said about sacrifice, it creates the future. How does Jesus then function in this? Jesus himself becomes the sacrifice, and a whole new future is created, and he tells his disciples to take up their cross and follow him. He tells his disciples to be the sacrifice. Now, Bret Weinstein, whatever what vision he has of what sacrifice he imagines people should make for a sustainable future which is now imperiled, is asking everyone to take up their crosses. But again, he castrates and bids it to be fruitful. Break the script, and you revert back to the old world. And that's exactly what we're seeing. Note the 20th century atheist ideologies. Nietzsche brings in the Nazis and the USSR, in which it is the state. The state is the grand goal. But who really wants to die for the state? We don't even like paying taxes. Well, we'll die for the state as long as the state itself isn't corrupt. As long as the state itself isn't in it for the individuals at the top. Isn't that when, you see, even the state only functions when the person at the top embodies the value of Christianity. In many ways, Christianity created the modern nation state, and the reason we call the people at the top public servants, and the reason we all get very annoyed and don't want to participate in the state when the people at the top are corrupt. And how do we understand corruption? They are in it for themselves and not for the good of those who are weaker than them down below. If you don't understand how Christianity produced all this stuff and how belief in these stories created the world that we are living in, you're not paying attention. Now we say, but is it true? Is there really a God? Or do we just need the God in order for it to function? And when we stop believing in the God, and we stop believing in the afterlife, and we stop believing in the power of sacrifice. Now this is a terrific conversation with John Vervaeke and JP. And I love the way I just love the way John is working through all of these conversations. And I'll tell you, even though I am a Christian and he is not, you can't find a better secular conversation partner than John to talk about these things. He's doing an amazing job. I wish Bret would learn a thing or two from John. But John asks, where's the phenomenology behind this? And I would argue, and I would point to Jordan Peterson's evangelistic impact, which seemed almost accidental to Jordan, because what Jordan wanted to do was try to prop up the story verse that is the underpinnings of Western civilization, and what he got in response to it was Christian evangelism. And I don't think that's an accident. It's what will flow out of it, because the thing that you very quickly realize is it's difficult to maintain apart from being embedded in the machine code story that we live within. But now what John and JP are wrestling with is, in fact, the real wrestlings we're having here in late stage Protestant secularity. We are skeptical, and now we seem to, because of the achievements that we've had building the culture verse, having dominion over the physical verse, even though it might be killing us now, because what we've done is we've taken power over it. We've made it, we've subjugated it, and now it's we've subjugated it, with our own greed, and now it's starting to fight back, and our host may kill us. But here it is. And so we're wrestling. Can we really believe in God? Can we really trust? Can we really go into the future? These are difficult questions. One of the things that we have to come to terms with, though, are the frames. What frame are we looking at it in? Now, another video that Dr. Jim, the cardiologist from Idaho, recommended to me, and I watched it a few times, is working through the philosophy of Alfred Sellis, and the fact that we have these two images we're dealing with now, the manifest image and the scientific image. And what I would argue is that, in a sense, we've always had these two images, because in some ways these images do map onto an axial age mythology, and we have the scientific image below and the manifest image above, the manifest image with character and story, and the scientific image that says, well, there's mysterious powers under here, which in fact we can harness from above. And so we need to continue to navigate these two images, and in fact we want to integrate them. But here's the thing, and this is what we keep coming into. We want to integrate them so that we are in charge, but we is always part of the manifest image, because unless it's me being in charge, but as Jonathan Peugeot and Jordan Peterson often note, as you find in the Bible, each of us is inside of ourselves a legion. There are many of us inside. We have our instincts, we have our stories. So we ourselves are not a whole. And so this manifest versus scientific is by no means going away or will be resolved. I think it's simply part of this dynamic. And if you want to read a prophecy about what happens if we think we can, in fact, destroy the manifest and make it completely subject to the scientific, well, read C.S. Lewis's Abolition of Man. And it sets up all of these strange incongruities of things like Bret Weinstein saying, we just have to transcend our scientific programming. But who is we? The machine can't transcend the machine, and well, can it? This is where we get self-transcendence in John Vervaeke's terminology. Well, with what do we self-transcend if that is all built from below? These are the questions we're wrestling with. Now, James K.A. Smith, who's a scholar at Calvin College, written a bunch of great books, points this out in his Rebel Wisdom Conversation, that all of these desires are a desire for a scientific solution which is embedded in the atheistic assumption that the only rational agency remaining is us. But right away, when you get to us, you've got a serious problem, because there's always us and there's always them. And unless you're going to be your own God, which is at the top of the hierarchy, imagine you have a monarchical vision of everything, you're always going to fight. And this is exactly what Bret Weinstein is bumping into. And this is exactly what we are bumping into when we look at the crisis of war or climate change or economics or anything. Our instincts, like people, there's too many of us. And so the natural tendency is, let us dehumanize the other so my one self can reign. And this is why Jonathan Peugeot sees the we in Bret Weinstein's tweet and says, that makes my blood run cold, because this is exactly what has happened throughout human history, and it is exactly what tyranny is. And what Christianity asserts is that, well, there is a non-human. It is not me, it is not you, us certainly more, but where is God? It is the body of Christ. That's what the church is, built in a temple of living stones where God dwells. And if you begin to understand Christian theology, you can understand how this works and why in Christian spiritual practices and liturgies, we look for God to help us, because if it isn't God, well, we try to instantiate this in U.S. law, which has impeachment hearings like now, when we say things like, no man is above the law. So you've basically created a divinity of such which is law, which all people need to be behind and below. And the problem with all of these conceptions of having science and technology do this, well, whose science and who is behind the curtain pulling the machines? Well, how did we get this far? Because again, what we have around us, even on dumpy little Florin Road, is truly amazing on the scope of humanity. Did a human being create the great leaps that gave us what we have today? We find many human contributors. Was it Ezekiel who helped deconstruct the karmic Babylonian? Well, Marduk is above the Lord. Oh, it all gets pulled apart with Ezekiel. Was it Daniel? Why do people call Jesus God? Think about that. Why do people call Jesus King? Jesus changed the world. How and why? See, the problem is people. Well, we're going to have a state. Well, what do we do with the state? Well, what happens with most states in human history is that a person wields the state as an instrument. In democracy, it's very Protestant of us. What do? We have the congregation agree, and that's a better attempt to sort of come to a consensus. And, well, in a Christian congregation, what do we try to do? We are trying to discern God's will. Well, what is God's will? Well, what is the God? The God gives his life for the welfare of the sinners. It's amazing we get so far away from this stuff we can't recognize. Or what's even more amazing is that we practice it without understanding what we're doing. That in a sense, when you're going to the ballot box in your democracy, you're going to the congregational meeting and deciding how to manage your community. Democracies grew out of Protestantism. The story verse affordance of what we appreciate and what we enjoy right now, imperfect though it may be, the story for its affordance has allowed for enormous communal collaboration with minimal tyranny. Jordan Peterson at one point notes what Piaget says: as long as you have to subjugate people, getting back to Bret Weinstein's imagining of a Darwinian process, if you have the carrying costs of tyranny, your nation will not do as well as other nations for which citizens freely give themselves, even give their lives, are willing to die heroically on the battlefield for a structure, for something like this. This is how we got here. Now, what happens if you lose the story? What happens if you lose the resurrection? What happens if you don't believe in it? What happens if Jesus is just a chump who was a moral philosopher, said a lot of things that give us a little bit warm fuzzy, don't really work, because everybody knows if you turn the other cheek, you usually get hit twice. And if you live like Jesus, you will die like Jesus. That's the way the world works. And if Jesus stayed dead, then Jesus' theology is the kind of chump theology that Nietzsche cast out and called out. And what we will get is the bickering and fighting that we as human beings do. And if we're going to dismiss religion, which is the way that we actually learn to collaborate, you're just going to get bickering. Anyone have a sense of how long it takes Talib to apologize? So here we have Bret Weinstein and Nassim Nicholas Talib arguing on Twitter. And what Talib notes is that there's a reason Christians are so easy to pick on. We got a master that says, love your enemies. We got a master that says, turn the other cheek. Now, do Christians do this? Not very often. But at least It's in the DNA. It's in the cultural DNA. It's how the system was produced. If you lose it, you are forced all the way back even before karma. Because karma, you get rid of the gods, that gets wiped out too. And there might be some karmic forces in terms of human beings keeping tabs. And if you do me a service, I'll do you a service. But that doesn't scale up very far because we have to learn to trust each other. Just read Jonathan Haidt's Happiness Hypothesis. He goes through these things and about rumor and gossip and about how these things work. If you lose the resurrection, you're back to this stuff. Now, Bret wants to say that evolution basically is achievement. Well, see, Darwin can't say achievement because in a blind Darwinian system, human beings are really no better. There's no evaluative process than other animals, because maybe those other hominids flourished for a while. Now we humans flourish for a while, but maybe, as the Matrix says, human beings are a terminal disease. And we grow and we flourish until we destroy our habitat and we kill ourselves. Is that where we are? That's just evolving into mimetic rivalry. It's what we do. But morality and worldview are deeply intertwined. And not all of it's the same. Again, René Girard. At some point, the Canadian government banned potlatch. Well, that's terribly culturally insensitive. If you look at the documents, you realize they banned potlatch for extremely good reasons. Good according to Christian morality. There was a tremendous destruction of wealth, in particular blankets and things like that. And it was a dreadful thing. Potlatch, where the people at the top of the hierarchy showed their power by destruction of property that their tribe needed. The Canadian government, moved by their moral values of Christianity, did a little bit of genocide on potlatch. Potlatch was as bad as anorexia and bulimia. It is a destruction which ultimately is for the prestige of 2 or 3 chiefs who are fighting about who will destroy the greatest quantity of goods. Now think about the Canadian people in the 19th century, rationalists and so forth. They felt it was their duty to forbid such an institution. Can you blame them for that? I'm sure they have been blamed for that. But again, notice how the image of Jesus dominates, that any chief who works his welfare at the expense of the tribe is not a good chief, because the chief of chiefs, the king of kings, works the people's welfare at his expense. The good chief dies for his people. Now again, dying for your people is a dumb move if your frame is now and you're the one dying. But if it's the people, they live. All of this comes from Christianity. Girard argues that we should try to understand why people acted as they did in the past, rather than blaming them. He says this, I think, not to excuse evil acts, but to point up a prevalent form of scapegoating. Blaming our ancestors always implies the claim that we would have done better in their shoes. It is a way of protesting our eternal innocence and brightening our self-esteem. That is what we object to. Otherwise, he said, he has no wish to try to justify the terrible and undeniable suffering of which Western civilization has been the cause. In other words, what Christianity affords is all of this communal posturing that we see back and forth, where I realize that I am a sinner, and I realize I am responsible for things that I never actually did. But we reinforce the story that puts the selfless servant who sacrifices himself at the top of the hierarchy. But again, what if the resurrection happened instead of didn't happen? And I know a lot of you wrestle with that. And I really appreciate what Peterson had to say, because when Tim Locke kind of backed him into a corner on that, Jordan Peterson, in the comfort of his office, did better than he did when he was on stage with Sam Harris. We're all weak. Because Peterson makes the observation, how powerful is the culture verse? How powerful is the story verse? Now, if for the first time in this video, hopefully I break the secular worldview, what if in fact Jesus did rise from the dead? What does that mean in terms of what this universe is? This is part of the reason why the simulation, even though I don't like that word, the simulation story opens up people's minds to think, what if we're not exactly living in what we think we are living in? What if, in fact, the universe is not quite composed of what we imagine it is composed of? What if laws of physics are actually laws and not just patterns? What if, in fact, there is a lawgiver who holds this stuff in relative stability? And what if, in fact, that lawgiver is doing all of this to create people in order that we would, in fact, grow up and be like the God? What is the limits of what is possible? What is faith? What is required of faith? Why is faith a gift? Because you don't just achieve it. It's actually something that you cultivate and you form because you desire to believe it. But the bulk of my argument in this video is that what we enjoy now is the product of the Christian faith. And when we lose the Christian faith, when we lose the capacity as individuals to willingly suffer for, well, what I can't enjoy. If I buy the secular frame, I see no reason to be a Christian. But if I am a Christian, I can in fact even give my life for a secular world that doesn't appreciate it.